Hi there, and welcome back to Sailing Beyond Knowledge, episode 11. And today you'll be listening to an interview with Dr. Thomas White, who is a professor at Loyola Marymount University, Los Angeles, and fellow of the Oxford Centre for Animal Ethics. And he has a very strong background in ethics and human ethics, and is an incredible researcher into the world of dolphins and how we can apply ethics in terms of measuring dolphin intelligence, going beyond our perceptions of what intelligence is. So it's a very substantial amount of research that Dr. Thomas White has devoted his life to since the 1980s, and I definitely recommend that you read his book In Defense of Dolphins, and you can visit his website to obtain that book or more information about the book and Dr. Thomas White's work at www.indefenseofdolphins.com. That's www.indefenseofdolphins.com, and I'll provide a link to the website along the summary with this show. And you can listen to that interview after this music called Sensing the Spheres by Enigma. We welcome Dr. Thomas White today, and Thomas is a professor at Loyola Marymount University, Los Angeles, and fellow of the Oxford Center for Animal Ethics. Thomas is also author of the groundbreaking publication that came out in 2007 called In Defense of the Dolphins, New Moral Frontiers. More recently, in January, The Times published an article acknowledging the work of Dr. Thomas White along with other scientists, inspiring a publicly growing awareness of dolphin intelligence by mainstream media. The Times states that scientists declare dolphins as the second most intelligent creatures after humans, and therefore need to be treated as non-human persons. So, Dr. White, welcome to the show, and thank you for taking time out in your busy schedule. And I hope
thank
all
you
is...
for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here.
Oh, thank you. Well, it's very encouraging to hear that more public attention is growing towards the issues of the dolphin.
Yes, that's, as I'm sure you're aware, many of us have been, for probably 20 years making comments of this sort and talking about the implications of the work that's been done on dolphins and other non-humans about the extent of consciousness throughout other beings on the planet. And our comments are typically to a relatively small group of people, but one of the very encouraging things is that the Times article did seem to get a good deal of popular interest, and so it's definitely been encouraging now that more in the mainstream media there's been much more discussion of this notion.
Yeah, because as you say, I mean, it's work that scientists have been doing for a long time. And when did you start this whole research yourself?
I started, I think it was 1988, and I was writing an introductory philosophy textbook, and the publisher had asked me to, in the chapters, start with non-philosophical topics and then through that get to philosophical ideas. Well, at the time I was living on the East Coast, and I had grown up in Massachusetts, and I was looking for a way in the book to work in something about the biological sciences. And on the East Coast, and as you know, no matter where you live, if you're by the ocean, you always hear interesting stories about dolphins. And a friend of mine had recently come back from one of the dolphin swim programs. And so I had been doing some reading and thought, well, it would be interesting at the time, when I got into it, it was just that it seemed like an interesting philosophical question to look at the scientific research on dolphins and ask if dolphins qualified for the status of personhood. Now, among philosophers, personhood is it's a philosophical concept as opposed to the biological concept of what it is to be a human. But what it means is any being, no matter what species, that would have all of those properties that we humans have traditionally said were unique to us. And so I wrote this really just at the time thinking it was going to be one chapter out of 16. But in the course of doing my research on that, while I was living in New Jersey at the time, I spent a summer in California and then met some more dolphin scientists, learned about more of the ethical issues connected with, at that point, the death of dolphins in connection with tuna fishing, the captivity of dolphins in entertainment facilities, and subsequent to that, I was introduced to Dr. Denise Herzing, who has been now for 25 years, I think, been doing a study of wild Atlantic spotted dolphins in the Bahamas. And so I then, in 1990, started going along watching her research. And as time went along, while I first did some short writing, I then thought, well, I really wanted to do a book on all of this. But coming to this as a philosopher rather than a scientist, I knew it would take quite a while for me to get up to speed, both in terms of the scientific literature and also being able to appreciate what was going on in the field. And so, started, more than 20 years ago, and ultimately eventuated in the book. But it was, and this is true, I know of many people who end up being interested in dolphins. It's probably the last thing I ever imagined I'd be doing at this point. Since my PhD is in philosophy and I specialized in 16th century Renaissance humanism. But it's endlessly fascinating, so I'm very lucky to have been able to do this kind of work.
Well, that's wonderful. One of the things I really appreciate about your book, I've only just started reading it, is how it carefully points out to the reader the importance to acknowledge our own traps of sort of measuring every other species with our own speciesism. And I think you talk about measuring other species with the sort of human yardstick, so to speak. Could you explain to listeners sort of what you mean by speciesism?
Well, the term speciesism came out as a parallel kind of term to racism and sexism, which is that in those cases the idea that there's a preconceived idea that one group, whether it's one race or one gender, is superior to the other, and the standard about and from my perspective as an ethicist, the standard about what kind of rights people have or what kind of moral standing they have, that's set by the dominant group. And the prejudice is that unless you're white or unless you're male, then you don't count. And that as we've seen, when you look at history of discrimination against other groups, whether it be on the basis of race or gender, sexual orientation, or whatever, it's typically the case that the standards are arbitrary and irrational. There's no good reason for them. And so we identify those when we talk about racism or sexism. We identify those as a bias because they aren't grounded in any evidence or any good reason. Speciesism is the same notion, that is that there is an inherent bias there that is grounded in a preconceived idea that one group is fundamentally superior to the other. And what scientists have been showing now over the last 30, 40 years is that many of the traits that humans have said were exclusively ours, that is not the case. And so if we're now asked, instead of it saying, well, is it being a human or not, the question really is, what kind of capacity do they have to suffer?
Absolutely.
What kind of vulnerabilities do they have? What kind of needs do they have? And to realize that there is not necessarily this preconceived idea that humans are superior, and that a more progressive understanding of this is to recognize the inherent value of each species. So the notion, that approach then tends to remove this preconceived prejudice, which is also what we try to do when we encounter racist or sexist activities as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's quite a fascinating subject, really, because we don't really necessarily objectify ourselves in that way, and everything that we measure is by our five senses. And I mean, from my own biological background, it's so not true the case. There's species out there of all different kinds of organisms that have experiences, intelligent experiences beyond the parameters of human five senses and beyond what we can imagine, and they perceive the world and experience the world in a different way. And I think that's a very important way to approach the subject, first of all, to make people aware, as to not get into the traps of seeing other beings as inferior to us anyway, although it's quite substantial that dolphins are very intelligent, sentient beings. I see you're doing...
Yeah, before we go on, one other thing that I think that as you're talking, people should keep in mind is that humans have automatically assumed that we are the brightest on the planet and the most capable being and the most successful being, but and therefore we're entitled to regard everything else as there for our use. But if you take a very objective look at the history of our species and as it relates to our time on the planet and all of that, humans are a very recent addition to the planet. There's no question that we don't treat one another particularly well. We regularly, over
Absolutely.
And if you were to say, one would like to think that the first marker of an intelligent species is that they act in ways that guarantee not only their own immediate survival, but the survivability of future generations of that species.
Mm-hmm.
You can look at our activity and say, we aren't doing such a good job, and there's no guarantee that that Homo sapiens will continue to exist for the next few millions of years or thousands of years until we start using our big brains better. So that's even another piece of it. That is, we have this automatic assumption that the human standard is a good one, whereas if you look at it, you can say we really need to be doing a much better job just in terms of our own welfare.
Absolutely. It's sort of evaluating, well, what is this thing that we call intelligence and consciousness? Because, as you say, we're not really acting in the most conscious way. It totally goes beyond that. If we were very intelligent beings, we wouldn't have got into this kind of unsustainable mess in the first place. But that's just my personal opinion.
Well, but I think that's true, and I think that when you look, for example, if you look at the difference between humans and dolphins, the modern dolphin is the descendant of, and all of the modern whales are descendants of a common ancestor that went back from the land to the ocean about 50 or 60 million years ago. And the modern dolphin, in its shape, size, brain configuration, and all, is about 15 million years old. Humans have been around anywhere from, I guess, 3 to 4 million years on the planet, and our brain shape, size, and Homo sapiens, we're probably talking about 100,000 years. Well, simply in the last few thousand years, humans have operated in a planet in which we regularly do make the very places where we live less habitable, whereas you look at dolphins and the other whales, they don't overpopulate, they don't overfish, they use their brains in a way that certainly has them in a more stable and sustainable way of life in their environment that you can't say that humans do. Think of all the times you'll hear people saying, oh, well, if we trash the earth fully, we'll develop a technology that lets us move someplace else. Well, it would seem that the first thing an intelligent species would want to do is at least keep its own home safe, rather than say, oh, well, we can make this unlivable and go someplace else. But when you look at dolphins, you have a very different model as far as an intelligent being that has basically solved the problem of long-term survivability.
Yeah, it's very true. It's interesting that this has come up again as well, because I spoke to Ed Ellsworth before about dolphins, and he was saying too, he very valuably pointed out that we have this obsession with ownership, which seems to have got us into a lot of trouble, really. And I totally agree with that. And also, I mean, referring to sustainability, personally, I feel that's become a political and power struggle issue among humans, because there is technology out there to give humanity a sustainable way of harnessing energy, etc. And again, this is why I brought the subject of dolphins into fruition, because it's our perspective on the world and ourselves and our interactive consciousness with other beings that really requires change in order for us to progress, and we can learn a lot from these animals.
Right, because if you just think of intelligence as referring to a set of abilities that allow a being to solve problems in its environment, to be successful, to survive over the long term, clearly what you see dolphins doing, and there's much scientific evidence for this, is they do have the capacity to There are different communities of dolphins that actually use tools in a certain way. Tools in the ocean is a different sort of thing. Tools in the land, on the land. But when you look at that, you can say, well, even if we just reduce intelligence to the notion of problem solving for a long-term, sustainable, safe future, that then becomes a different model than what humans tend to do, which is to say, oh, intelligence is the thing that gives us all of these technologies. And we don't then say, well, that may be true, but the real test of intelligence is, can you use the technology in a way that makes life safer and better, rather than using the technology that makes life then less safe?
That's a very good point. Absolutely. And you're going to be doing a talk at the conference in February, is that correct, in San Diego?
Yes, the American Association for the Advancement of Science.
Oh, okay.
Laurie Marino, scientist, Diana Reese, a scientist, and I are presenting a panel on the ethical implications connected with research on dolphin intelligence. Diana is a scientist at Hunter College in New York City. Laurie, and has been a background as a psychologist, and she's done work for decades on dolphin intelligence. Laurie Marino at Emory University in Atlanta is really the premier dolphin scientist on the dolphin brain. And she and Diana have also jointly done research on dolphin awareness. The commentator on the panel will be Jerry Schubel, who is the director of the Aquarium of the Pacific in Long Beach, California, and he's a very prominent marine scientist. But and I'm commenting on the ethical issues. But what the panel does, it's set up to review the most recent research on dolphin intelligence, dolphin brain structure. My contention that what this amounts to then is dolphins should be regarded as non-human persons, and to explore then what the ethical and policy implications of all of that are. We've been very happy with the fact that we've been getting a good deal of attention to this upcoming panel.
Yeah. Will this in any way be open afterwards to public archives? Are you going to be recording this conference at all? Or?
That's a very good question, and it's one of the things I need to look into this week. I've got a note to myself to try to check that out, but I haven't.
Well, keep us updated on that one.
I'm certainly hoping.
Yeah, yeah, because I'm sure listeners will be very interested in the results and try and get more information from that. I'll also direct them to your website as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, so what will you be covering? I know we haven't got much time here right now, but would you mind giving us like a brief summary of what you'll be covering in that conference?
Sure. As you can imagine, these conferences, one doesn't have a great deal of time. So much of what I'm going to be doing is a very short version of some of the key issues that come up in my book, which you've already mentioned. But the shortest version of it is that I would claim, and I'll be speaking after Laurie and Diana talk, where they review much of the research on dolphin intellectual behavior, capacity, and the dolphin brain. But the simplest version of it is that when I claim that dolphins are non-human persons, I'm saying that dolphins have many of the same abilities that humans have said used to be ours alone. Those are things like having the ability to have a sense of self, emotion, personality, individuality, a sense of uniqueness, the ability to have a sense of self that goes back into the past, that you can project into the future, the ability to control your own behavior rather than just engage in stimulus and response, or act out of instinct, the ability to engage in abstract thinking that lets you plan behavior, the ability to communicate in a way that suggests abstract thought. And what I do in the book is to survey the research of about the last 30 years, looking at probably the work of about 20 different scientists, that in each case reveals the different facet of the combination of abilities that dolphins have, so that I'd say at the end of all of that, dolphins then share version of the same kind of abilities that we have. It's not exactly the same, and we wouldn't expect a being in the ocean to have the same kind of intelligence that we do. And so what I'm suggesting is that dolphins have those abilities, should be regarded as non-human persons, and therefore deserve better treatment than what we've been giving them. Now, I want to hasten to add, because that claim can be misunderstood. I am not saying that only beings who are persons, whether humans, dolphins, or rather only beings who are dolphins, have moral standing or deserve appropriate treatment. There are many other reasons that we should be compassionate, that we should recognize the rights of other beings who just because they aren't persons doesn't mean that they don't have rights. But what I've been doing for about 20 years is trying to come up with an argument that would convince even the skeptic. And this is the one that seems to work relatively well in saying, look, there may be other beings out there who also deserve different treatment than the way that we're giving them. And there are no doubt other beings who are non-humans who also should be seen as persons, whether it's chimps or gorillas or elephants. But what I'm claiming is that dolphins have those properties. It means they have a greater capacity, for example, for suffering than we thought. And from an ethical standpoint, at the very least, what that means is that they should not be slaughtered, as they are being in a variety of places on the planet. And it also raises very serious objections to the whole issue of dolphin captivity. The bottom line on all of this is that it then is a very different, when you say what we're talking about is a person rather than something that's an object of property, the ethical implications of that are profound, because it's then we say, well, we're dealing with someone who is a who rather than an object which is a what, you might say.
Absolutely, that's interesting.
So that would kind of be the shortest version of what, of what I'll be saying.
Thank you very much for that. And yeah, it's very interesting. Some very valid points there. Also, well, I don't know if you've heard of Richard Connor's work. He was.
Oh yes.
Yeah. I just came across him today. I just read an article he wrote, very brief article about 2003, where he studied dolphins in the Indian Ocean, bottlenose dolphins, and he was just talking about sort of relating their behavior to human behavior, really, on how they can be aggressive. I mean, we know very well that they can be very altruistic, and also to humans they're very compassionate, and there have been cases of them rescuing people and protecting people from shark attacks. But you've also got this aspect which shows how very complex their social behavior is amongst themselves. And he talks about the males forming groups and collaborating with other groups to outsmart a third group to steal their females, which I found quite interesting.
Yes, and it's the first research that was showing, I suppose, what you'd call a political dimension to their intelligence.
Yeah, it was the Machiavellian tactics, he called it.
And it shouldn't be surprising that no matter what kind of being we're looking at, it shouldn't be surprising that we would find aggression of one sort or another. But because it would be impossible to survive if you were a totally non-aggressive species.
Yeah.
But what has always struck me, and in many cases, the observations that I've been involved in with Denise Herzing's work in the Bahamas, what I've always been struck with is how restrained dolphin aggression is. They can be quite aggressive with one another, but frequently it's more psychological. Even when it escalates to there being some kind of physical element in it, it's not as though they go around killing one another, which cannot be the same for humans. They seem to engage in aggression among themselves. They seem to work things out, and then things will calm down. And that's a very different model of aggression than you find with humans, where it can escalate very quickly to the point where we're killing one another, and killing one another over
wow, I see, that's the way we really can learn from them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and that would be, I mean, ideally, I'm sure if you talk to any psychologist, they would say part of emotional development and emotional sophistication is not that you avoid conflict, but that you know how to manage conflict so that the genuine issues that drive it get resolved, and the emotionally mature people then manage how to defuse a situation, address the issue, and move along. It's when you don't address, when you get to a point where communication and resolution breaks down, then people get frustrated that they just start killing one another. But that certainly is not what you want to have as the model for long-term emotional health and development of the species.
No, absolutely. Well, that was going to be one of my questions as well. I mean, you've already touched on that they show great reasoning and choice before acting, and that shows a greatly evolved consciousness, and it's something that we really do kind of score quite low on in some respects.
Well, I think that we as humans have great potential, and there are many wonderful human beings who do terrific things. But it's still too often the case that we can point to examples where just from thoughtlessness, this isn't even a matter of people being malevolent, but just from thoughtlessness, we get a great deal of harm that comes from situations. And we then say, well, we need to look at this and see what we can learn for the future. But one would hope that we'd use our big brains in a way that was a little more farsighted in preventing unintentional harm and unintended harm to people. So we can definitely, I think we have huge potential, but I think we definitely have to do a better job on that.
Absolutely. With your findings, and I mean, your work is just extensive, and the scope of it, and with Diana Reese and these other scientists, and with what they present, how do you feel we can evolve with that information, and possibly campaign against military use of these animals and their protection?
Well, I think the first thing is exactly the kind of conversation that you and I are having. That's very important to take place because of the fact that people will listen, they will become more aware of the issue. The very fact that this panel is going on at this scientific conference is in itself very important, because I'm sure 10 years ago it would not have been accepted as an appropriate topic because the scientific consensus was not there.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the more that we all talk about these issues, the more it gives us momentum and kind of development of the human consciousness to be more aware of these things. And part of that then is an awareness of where the big ethical problems are. Now, for example, the campaign to try to end the drive hunts in Japan that go on, I think now just in one village, but there's a documentary that was released in the States called The Cove. I don't know if that's gotten to the UK yet.
Yeah.
But with a very disturbing documentary about that, and that's something that people can focus on and try to look for ways to bring attention to bring that to a halt. There are slaughters in the Solomon Islands, I believe, in the Faroe Islands. There are other than ethical issues in connection with captivity, whether it be for the military or entertainment.
Mm.
And I think that what people need to do is we continue having this conversation. We continue pointing out the scientific facts that undergird all of this. People look into the ethical dimensions of that, see what kind of issue they're most concerned about, and then try to focus their attention accordingly. I think that this is one of those situations, because I frequently get the question, well, what is the next thing that we all should do? And because of the progress that we've seen, even in the last few years, I am confident that the more that we all simply talk about these issues, get them more into the mainstream, get them more to kind of a clearer level of consciousness among those of us who talk about this and those of us who listen to it, the more we will find ways to have a practical impact. It is one of the benefits of humans' fascination with language, that it is true that the more we talk about things, the
hopefully it will materialise that way. I have had some people who I don't particularly think really value that the dolphins should be treated as sentient beings in their own right. Some people might say, oh, that dolphin is a very compassionate being, therefore it doesn't mind being part of this human therapy program. What would you say to somebody who comes out with a statement like that? Because dolphins are used in therapies that benefit human beings and people with Down syndrome and things like that. And they're kept in captivity for those uses, or they're used in that way in the wild as well. There's various programs for that, and some people would say that they don't mind being used in that way. What would you say to someone who comes out with such a statement?
Well, from my perspective, the big problem is how you know that they're actually consenting to the situation rather than simply tolerating the situation. The big problem, one of the big problems that we're talking about is interspecies communication. And dolphins are highly social. They, as you know, are in many ways very passionate. This is one of those issues that I have, obviously much more thinking to do on. I know that in some of the research that's been done on therapeutic situations, it's not as persuasive that in fact there's a lot of good happening as much as we thought, or that the dolphins are not in some way being used in some way. But this also just goes back to this thing I mentioned before, that when you talk about being as a person, you have a person rather than an object who is kind of property. From an ethical standpoint, it's critical to be very careful in saying we have to make sure that we are respecting the dignity of that being, that it is a matter of choice. And when you have species that are so different as humans and dolphins, we have to make sure we aren't making the same mistake in saying, well, if a human acted this way, it would mean they don't mind.
Absolutely.
How can we be certain that means the same thing when a dolphin does it, that they are consenting rather than they're just tolerating the situation?
Yeah.
So that's one that it's obviously much more complicated than some of the other ethical issues. But it really is a very good question to raise.
But still, we are, as you say, we can't assume that just because they're compassionate beings that they are willing to tolerate a confinement.
And it's one thing if you're talking about dolphins in a natural setting in the open ocean, but the biggest problem with captive situations is that what we know from dolphin social behavior in the wild is that they are remarkably social, far more social than human beings. They have a greater need, I think, than we do for a rich social network in order for them to grow and develop, and as the way some people talk about it, flourish. In terms of the characteristics of their nature. And I have not seen a captive facility where I'm convinced that those needs of this great need for social community could really be met.
Uh-huh.
So it then becomes very much a kind of quality of life issue as opposed to, are they being harmed, harmed or not. But that also then obviously becomes a kind of very significant issue that we need to talk about.
Yeah, you did some of your work and your research at the Dolphin Research Centre, where you say they could, if they chose to, jump in and out of the facility. And what's your view on the research centre there? And
well, the Dolphin Research Center in Marathon, Florida, is the first facility that I went to, and it's in the dolphins are in a natural setting. They, as captive facilities go, in my mind, it's probably the best one because the staff there is pretty devoted. It's not concrete tanks or anything like that. they are, and dolphin communities having cultures. If a dolphin in a captive facility were simply to go out into the wild, its survivability, I think, would be, certainly without its extensive retraining, its survivability would be highly problematic.
Mm.
So there again, you say, well, are they remaining because they are choosing to, or are they remaining because they don't have another good option, and they don't have the skills, for example, to hunt or to communicate and operate within another kind of community?
Yeah, they're very valid issues there. Well, we've gone over 10 minutes of the time that allocated, Dr. Thomas White. So if there's anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up the conversation, please do.
Well, I'd just like to thank you for the opportunity and encourage your listeners to continue thinking about these things, and I want to express my appreciation to you and them for the opportunity to talk about these things.
Well, thank you, and I feel that your work is a very valuable contribution to raising consciousness, and I hope you keep us updated and let us know if there's a public archive of the conference that you'll be attending.
Yes, I definitely will. When I find out about that, I'll definitely let you know.
Thank you, good luck, and thanks again for your time.
Carlita, thank you again, and I will talk to you soon. I urge all your listeners to keep tuning in to Sailing Beyond Knowledge Radio.
simplicity rash, though it begins in unwisdom. What is newly born is innocent, and it needs to become aware. These two, simplicity with awareness, should lead to clarity.